Hilchos Shechitah Perek Shlishi, the laws of ritual slaughter, chapter 3. In chapter 1, the Rambam told us that while the Torah says, V'zavachta mibkarcho mitzoincha, that before you eat, you need to slaughter your cattle or your sheep, the Torah doesn't delineate any of the parameters or the guidelines for how to go about the slaughtering. Specifically, the Rambam said one can ask 8 questions. 8 things remain unclear about the laws of ritual slaughter. Where on the animal do we slaughter? How much do you have to cut to be requiring slaughter? Where do you slaughter? Who can slaughter? Etc. A whole bunch of questions. And we addressed 6 of them in the last 2 days. Today the Rambam addresses the 7th one, and that is, what are the acts that would disqualify or invalidate a shechitah, a ritual slaughter? That's the topic today. As we're going to see, the Rambam took this straight from the Talmud. There are 5 things, 5 separate acts that cannot be done during the act of shechitah, and if they are done, they disqualify the shechitah, and the Rambam will define the parameters of each one. Says the Rambam, halacha aleph, chamisha dvarim mafsidin es hashchita. 5 things invalidate a ritual slaughter. The ikar hilchos shechitah, and the core principle, when you say the laws of ritual slaughter, what's the reference to the laws of ritual slaughter? Lihizar b'chol achas me'en. It means being careful in each of these 5 things. We'll see tomorrow when the Rambam talks about who is fit to slaughter. Many times he's going to refer to the concept of a Jew who knows the laws of Shechitah. What does it mean, a Jew who knows the laws of Shechitah? Somebody who knows the laws governing these 5 disqualifications. The Eluhain, and they are the following. Shehiyah. Shehiyah means pausing. Drasa. Drasa means pressing. Chalada, literal translation, burrowing or digging into, as we'll soon see. Hagrama, which literally means inclining. Ve'ikur, Rashi in the Talmud translates ikor as tearing, but we're going to see the Rambam understands the word ikor to mean dislodging, dislocating. And the Rambam defines each one. We begin with shehiyah. Shehiyah ketzad. What is considered a pause that disqualifies a shechitah? Harei shehischel ishchait. Let's say somebody began to slaughter a cow or a goat or a bird. V'higbiya yadai kaidem sheyigmar hashchita, and he lifts his hands, removes the knife from the neck before he finishes the full slaughter. Full slaughter meaning, in the concept of an animal, it would be most of the 2 pipes, windpipe and the food pipe. For a bird, most of one of the pipes at least. So before he concludes the act that would be considered a full ritual slaughter, removes his hands, vishaha, and he pauses. He takes a pause. Bein b'shoigig, bein b'mezid, bein b'oines, for whatever reason, whether he makes the pause inadvertently, purposely, circumstances beyond his control. V'chazar huay acher v'gamar es hashchita. And after the pause, he goes back, somebody else goes back maybe, and finishes the ritual slaughter. Im shaha kadei sheyagbia es habehema v'yarbitzena v'yishchait. If he waits enough time, in other words, if the interval is long enough, that during that time he would be able to lift up the animal from its position in shechitah. As we spoke yesterday, the typical position for an animal was to be turned over with its neck facing up, so the knife could easily slaughter the animal. So if there's enough time to lift up the animal and put it back down and complete a shechitah, shechitah se psula, that's too much time has elapsed, and therefore the slaughter is invalidated. But if the interval that he paused was less than this amount of time, then the ritual slaughter is kosher. We said before that the amount is to pick up the animal, put it back down. Which animal are we talking about? If it's what's called a thin animal in halacha, a sheep or a goat, the amount of pause that would invalidate its ritual slaughter is the time it takes to lift up an animal of its kind, a thin kosher animal, put it back down, and slaughter it. If it was a large, thick animal, a cow, an ox, a deer, so then the amount would be to lift it up, put it down, and slaughter. In other words, each animal is governed according to its type. If you're slaughtering a bird, interestingly, the pause that's allowed is the time it takes to lift up a thin animal and put it back down and slaughter it. In other words, with the birds, we don't go with a bird of its similar type, because in general, birds, as we spoke yesterday, were not slaughtered in that position of being crouching down. They were simply held, neck was stretched and slaughtered. So the shehiyah, the pause amount of time, is going to be governed by a regular smaller animal. Halacha dalet. Shachat ma'at v'shaha ma'at. If he slaughters a bit of the required pipes, takes a small pause. V'chazar v'shachat ma'at v'shaha ma'at, and then continues slaughtering, and another little delay. Ad shegamar hashchita. In the end, he concluded the entire ritual slaughter. V'lo shaha b'pam achas shir hashihiyah. And in each individual pause, he didn't wait enough time to be considered a full invalidating pause. However, aval kishetachshev kol zman hashihiyah, were you to calculate all the pauses together, yitztaref mikulan shir shihiyah, the amount for a requisite invalidating pause would be reached. Harezu sveik nevela. Now, according to the Rambam, we're in a doubtful status. We're not sure if this animal is considered to be good and well slaughtered, or a nevela unslaughtered. Also, if the pause was one pause, but it was almost as long as the required pause, you waited enough time to lift up the animal, put it back down, and enough time not to complete a full act of slaughter, but to slaughter only the minority of the required pipes. Not enough time to finish the entire ritual slaughter. Here too, we're in doubt whether this is a good slaughter or not. The reason why it's a doubt is because every shihiyah, every pause, begins with a partial shechitah. You've done part of the act of ritual slaughter. So perhaps we're going to combine that with the wait time and say that together with the initial partial slit and the pause to lift it up, put it back down, and to complete a minority of the act, we can combine that minority with the original partial slaughter that you did, and it will now be considered to be a nevela, but that's a doubt, and therefore we're not certain where that comes down. Halacha hey, shachat reiv echad ba'oif, or reiv shnayim ba'behema. If you slaughtered the requisite amount, most of one pipe if it came to a bird, most of two of the pipes if you're talking about an animal, then afal pisha shaha chatzi ayoim, even if you waited a half a day, v'chazar v'gamar chatichas asimonin, and then you came back and concluded cutting the entire pipes, harezu muteres, that's permitted. Me'achar shenishchad b'kashir, once you've slaughtered enough, the requisite amount to be considered a kosher slaughter, hareze kimechatich psara shchuta, the cut that you come and do later after a half a day wait is simply like cutting slaughtered meat, dead meat. The pause is only an issue if it's during the act of ritual slaughter. Halacha vav shachat bakana levadei chetziyoi oimiutai, if you cut only the windpipe, halfway or a minority, v'shahazman meruba, and you waited a long time, hareze chayzer v'goymer hashchita ve'ein bekach klum. You can actually go back, complete the shechitah, and the fact that you cut halfway through the windpipe means nothing. And the reason we're going to see in a second is because an animal can survive with half of its windpipe or a minority of its windpipe cut. And so your act is not going to be seen as the beginning of ritual slaughter, but rather as another life circumstance that happened to the animal. Only when you come back later and conclude the shechitah, will that be considered the shechitah, and that's a kosher shechitah. Avalim shachat reiv hakonen. But the moment you slaughter most of the windpipe, or if it's the food pipe, even the tiniest puncture, v'shaha kashir, and then you took the requisite pause, the requisite invalidating pause, bein shechazar v'gamar hashchita shehischil. Then whether you go back and complete the act which you started, in other words, you finish off cutting the windpipe and some of the food pipe, or you finish off cutting the food pipe, whatever way you started. In other words, you're concluding your original act. Bein sheshachat shchita gmura b'makem acher, or you did a whole other act of ritual slaughter in a different point on the animal's neck. Harezu psula, this shchita is invalidated. Why? Because an animal or a bird, where most of its windpipe was severed, or its food pipe received the slightest puncture, nevela is automatically considered to be dead. Doing ritual slaughter to such an animal later doesn't help, as will be explained in the end or the later chapters of these laws, where we're going to discuss the laws of treifa in great detail. So while the windpipe can suffer a sever of halfway through or less than that, and that's not considered to be the beginning of a shechitah because it could survive that, more than halfway through the windpipe or a small puncture in the food pipe already renders the animal basically dead, treifa, mortally wounded, is going to die within 12 months, and therefore the shechitah that you do later is not going to help. There's an interesting note from the Rebbe. After Gimel Tammuz was discovered in the Rebbe's office, personal diaries, personal notes that he wrote, different commentaries in different Torah areas, and one of them is a commentary on this piece of the Rambam where he explains the difference between the windpipe and the food pipe. How come when it comes to the windpipe we say an animal can live with even half of its pipe severed, but when it comes to the food pipe, even the slightest puncture makes a huge difference. So the Rebbe says the difference between air and food can basically be compared to the difference between spirituality and physicality. Spirituality is abstract, ethereal, we can't touch it. Food represents physicality. Every Jew needs to have a windpipe and a food pipe. Every Jew needs to have both physical needs, material needs met, and also he needs to be able to aspire and reach spiritual growth. So the thing is, and it's a bit counterintuitive, the Rebbe says, when it comes to the physicality of a Jew, once you're in the world of materialism, the smallest fall or the smallest stumble could have very big consequences. In spiritual matters, just a tiny stumble doesn't necessarily throw you that much off track. So therefore, when it comes, the animal represents this concept. When it comes to the food pipe, even the smallest puncture makes a huge difference. It already renders the animal into a treifa because a small issue has been discovered in the material element. But when it comes to the spiritual, the windpipe, even halfway could be severed. Once the majority is severed, of course, you're out of whack. But as long as the majority is not severed, the consequences aren't so major on the spiritual element of a Jew's life. An interesting point from the Rebbe. Halacha zayin hinin yisbar lecha. Behold, what turns out, if you've been following the different variables described in the previous laws, it turns out the following. She'ein shehiyah bakana be'oif klal. If we're dealing with a bird, once you slaughter the windpipe, there's no such thing as a pause that could affect it. Either way, if you slaughtered most of the windpipe and then you took the pause, for a bird, even slaughtering one pipe is already enough to consider it ritually slaughtered. So it's done. The pause that you take later is of no consequence. When you go back and finish the cutting, you're cutting dead meat. Versus if you only slaughtered part of the windpipe, a minority of the windpipe, even half of it, as long as you didn't cross the threshold to the majority, and then you took the pause, you can go back and slaughter whenever you want. Because the animal won't become dead and not kosher unless most of the windpipe is severed. As long as you haven't severed most of the windpipe, the pause makes no difference. So when it comes to a bird, if it's the windpipe we're dealing with, pause can never affect it for the good or for the bad. On the other hand, of course, the food pipe, even the slightest puncture, is already going to be considered invalidating it, and so a pause afterwards would be detrimental and cause it to be invalidated. Shechitah, he says the Rambam, what if you slaughtered a bird and you took a pause, but you don't know if you punctured the food pipe or you didn't. Had you punctured the food pipe before you began the weight invalidates it. If you didn't touch the food pipe before you took the weight doesn't invalidate it. So what do you do? What the slaughterer should do is slaughter the windpipe completely in a different spot, which is for sure a kosher ritual slaughter. Leave it till it dies. And after the animal dies, after the bird dies, check its gullet, check the food pipe. Says by tipas dam, if no drop of blood was discovered on it, then it's for sure known that it didn't get a puncture in the original slaughter, and it's kosher. And that's the way to determine whether this bird is kosher or not. That covers the laws of the first of the 5 disqualifying factors for shechitah. That's shehiyah, pausing. Now we move on to the second one, chalada ketzat. What does it mean, burrowing or digging in? The word chalada comes from chulda, because a weasel was known to dig, to burrow into the ground, come into homes or whatever it is. So we're going to soon see this chalada, this disqualifying act, involves an act of burrowing, hiding the knife inside the animal. That's why it's called chalada. So what qualifies, or what disqualifies, as chalada? This will be clearer when we look at the picture of the full animal that we brought up in chapter 1. Here's the full animal. You can see there's the 2 pipes that need to be slaughtered. The windpipe rests a little bit forward towards the neck than does the food pipe. They're actually literally almost touching each other, but for geographical purposes, speaking to understand this halacha, one is more forward than the other. So it's possible to insert the knife into the animal's neck in a way that it's going to reach exactly in between the pipes. So what happened is essentially is that the slaughterer puts the knife into the animal's neck, but he hasn't done any act that involves slaughter because he hasn't touched either of the 2 pipes. So now, says the Rambam, you put in the knife between the 2 pipes, and then from while your knife is in that position inside the animal, then you make the slit. Whether you then go and sever the higher pipe, in other words, the food pipe, which is further back in the animal's system, from the state of the knife being hidden, you then go and chop up to the food pipe, or you slaughter the lower pipe, which is the windpipe going downwards, following the normal way of Shechitah, Harei zu psula, that's disqualified. So the way I just explained it now is that the food pipe is called the higher pipe, and the windpipe is called the lower pipe. The alternative explanation is talking about an animal that's actually flipped over in a position ready for ritual slaughter, then it would be the opposite. The higher pipe would be the windpipe. In other words, if the animal's lying upside down, so you stuck in the knife, above your knife is the windpipe. So if you go upwards, slaughtering the upper sign, or you go downwards, continuing in what would usually be a kosher slaughter motion, putting your knife downwards and cutting the food pipe, the point is, it's disqualified. Why? Because before the act of ritual slaughter began, your knife was hidden. Chalada, it was burrowed in to the animal. That's the main biblical way of disqualifying through chalada. There are other ways that are considered to be doubtful. The knife is also hidden, that's the bottom line, but it's not certain that it's a complete disqualification. And that is in halacha yud. Hichnis es hasakin, tachas ha'oir. You inserted the knife under the skin, but just under the initial layer of the skin. V'shachat shnei asimanim kedarkan. You cut the two pipes in a completely normal fashion. So versus in the original case, where you actually inserted the knife between the two pipes, here you just inserted the knife under the animal's skin, and then from there proceeded to slaughter both signs, both pipes normally. Or the animal that you were dealing with had lots of wool in the area of the neck, as in the sheep pictured in this picture here. And you put your knife, before you began to slaughter, into the thicket of this wool. And from there, you slaughtered it. Or you spread a cloth over the knife and over the neck. And you slaughtered normally, but it was done under a cloth. Since the knife is not uncovered, this goes into the category of chalada in a doubtful way, and the animal is considered to be in doubt whether it's a nevela, whether it's non-kosher meat. I heard from a sheikhah today that in the modern age there's a question if you put plastic over the animal. When you slaughter an animal, it gets very, very bloody very, very quickly. So what you want to do is you want to put a clear plastic cover over the neck of the animal. Is this considered chalada or not? The Rambam said if you spread a cloth over the knife and the neck, since the knife is not uncovered, gluya was the word, revealed, that's why it's problematic. But in the case of a clear plastic cover, you could actually see the knife. You're not really covering it. Others are of the opinion that no, it's not about whether you can see the knife or not. Bottom line is the knife is covered, and therefore you shouldn't even use plastic covers before Shechitah. Just an interesting point. Similarly, says the Rambam, if you slaughtered part of the signs, part of the pipes, in a state of burrowing, in other words, the knife was inside the skin, and you slaughtered part of the windpipe and the food pipe, the gabar shechita shalei b'hachlada, then you finished the shechita, you removed the knife from its hidden state, and you went back in and finished the shechita, not in a state of hidden knife. Harezus fake nevela, still because you began it in a state of chalada, it's now a doubtful nevela, very possibly that this animal is not kosher. And that is the second of the 5 disqualifying factors. We move on now to the third. Drasa. Drasa means pressing. Drasa ketzad. What is the act of pressing which disqualifies a shechita? Kegoin shehika besakin al hatzavar. This would be where somebody came down with a knife and struck the neck. We learned yesterday that you have to do a forward and backward motion in order for the shechita to be valid. Here he just came down with the knife and boom, slaughter the animal. Kederach shemakin besayif, like you behead with a sword. And you cut through both pipes at once without a forward and backward thrusting motion. That would be drasa, a disqualifying shechita. Or let's say you didn't come down. You simply put the knife onto the neck, and you press down, cutting downwards. Like one would do when cutting a radish or a squash. And you press down the knife, kept on pressing till it came down through the pipes. This is disqualified. Shechita needs to be backwards and forwards. Easy definition. Moving on to number 4, hagrama ketzat. What is considered inclining? Inclining in a way that disqualifies the shechita. So this is actually going to have a very specific definition, and it might be good to take a look at this picture here. This is the koneh, the windpipe. The windpipe is made up of a series of rings, and we'll talk a little more about these rings in a minute. And the rings are attached by this connective tissue, which makes up the entire koneh. Each of those rings is actually not a complete ring. It doesn't surround the skin of the windpipe completely. There's a long strip of connective tissue that runs along over here at the edge of where the rings kind of conclude and holds everything together around the windpipe. At the top, however, there is what's called the tabas hagdola, the great ring, which is a ring that does encircle the entire skin of the trachea and kind of leads into what's called the koiva, the helmet, or the thyroid cartilage, if you're familiar with the anatomy, which is going to begin to cover the windpipe in a way that can be covered, for example, when the animal swallows food, as the humans have also in our system. In halacha, this koiva, this cap or this helmet, which is ultimately going to cover the windpipe, begins to slant at an incline at this point, and the incline is called the shipui koiva, the incline or the slant of the cap. On the other side of the windpipe, as you can see here in the picture, you have what's called the chitim. Chitim literally mean wheat kernels. In English, they're called the corniculate cartilage. That helps cover the opening to the animal's windpipe when it's swallowing food. So, bottom line is, we learned in chapter 1 that the windpipe can be severed for shechitah anywhere below the shipui koiva, anywhere below the incline of the cap, the incline of where the windpipe begins to be covered. Hagrama, inclining, the disqualifying act of inclining, is defined by the Rambam, ze hashechet bakana lemayla b'makom she'eino ra'oi l'shchita. It's a very specific definition. Somebody who slaughters the windpipe above the normal place at a point which would not be fitting for shchita, for ritual slaughter. Now, says the Rambam, there are like two wheat kernels. They're called that because that's the shape, the corniculate cartilage, that sits at the top of the windpipe, l'mayla b'tabaz gedola, above the great ring, top ring which encircles the entire trachea, entire windpipe, and that area carries some question. Is that considered to be above or below the point at which the windpipe is permitted to be slaughtered? If somebody were to slaughter into those wheat kernel-like nodes, if you left even the tiniest bit at the top, in other words, you slaughtered below the highest point of those chitim, the shechitah is kosher. Because that classifies as going below the slant of the cap. Or the other side of the slant, here you can see, when you slaughter into the nodes and you leave even the tiniest bit, you're lower than the slant which is disqualifying. Which is therefore the place that's fit for shechitah. But if you didn't leave anything over of the nodes, you slaughtered into the top of the node, so to speak, and you slaughtered above them, this is now called an animal that was slaughtered at an incline, above the place on the windpipe which is kosher for shechitah, and it's disqualified. Says the Rambam Malacha Yud Gimel, Shachat roiv ha'echad or roiv ha'shnayim. A person slaughtered most of one of the pipes, if it's talking about a bird, which is a full ritual slaughter, or most of two of the pipes, if it's talking about an animal, v'hishlim hashchita bidrasa eba hagrama. And then you concluded the slaughter after having done the minimal amount required by law. You then did an act which would have disqualified it in the beginning. You pressed the knife against the rest of the pipes. You inclined the knife upwards towards the top of the pipes. Harei zuksheda, this is a kosher shchita. Sharei nishchat ashir karai, because before you did the invalidating act, you had already slaughtered it properly. Higrim batchila shlish. If you began the shechitah at an improper incline, concluding going through a third of the windpipe, and then you slaughtered properly the other 2/3 of the windpipe, it's kosher, even though you began in a non-kosher way, but you finished in a kosher way, and that's fine. If you slaughtered a third properly, the next third at an incline improperly, and the next third properly in the proper place, it's kosher. Again, sum total, you did the majority in a kosher way. Higrim shlish v'shachat shlish v'chazar v'higrim shlish ha'acharain, third at an incline, a third properly, and the last third at an incline again, harei zu psula, this is disqualified, because the majority now has been done in an improper way. V'im darasai hechlid, that's the whole third issue is only true of the incline issue. But if we're talking about pressing, or burrowing, hiding the knife inside, bein bashlish harishain, bein bashlish ha'imtzoi, whether you did so in the first third, or the middle third, even though in total it was less than the majority of the entire shechita, harei zu psula, for those two, it's disqualified on account, even if any part was done with pressing or burrowing, it invalidates it. Of course, we're talking about before you did the majority in a proper way. If you did the majority in a proper way, even if later you pressed or later you burrowed, as we just learned, that's kosher. Yud Daled, we move on to the fifth and final invalidating act in shechita. Ikur ketzad. What qualifies as dislodging? Here's the loose string on the guitar. Same thing will apply in the animal. The windpipe became dislocated from its place attached to the jaw. Gargeres is another name for kana, another name for windpipe. Oy haveshet, or the gullet, the food pipe, became dislodged. V'nishmat echad mihan oishneyan kaidem gemar shechita. And before you had a chance to finish the slaughter, both of them or one of them slipped out of their place. Avalim shachat echad ba'oif ayrubai. But if you had already slaughtered in a bird, let's say, one full or a majority of one of the pipes, v'achar kach nishmat hasiman ashenin, and the second pipe slips out of its place, shechitah seikshera, the shechitah of course is kosher because you've already done a proper act of ritual slaughter. Tezvav nishmat echad mehen. The achar kach shachat hasheni, if it's a bird, let's say, one of the pipes become dislocated, but you slaughtered the other pipe that was still attached, and one pipe is enough on a bird. Nevertheless, shechitah say psula, the shechitah is disqualified because before you began the shechitah, one of them was already dislodged. Shachat echad mehen v'nimtza hasheni shamut. You slaughter one pipe, and when you open up the animal, or the bird in this case, you see that the other pipe actually was dislodged. But you don't know if it was dislodged before or after the shechita. You're in doubt, this bird might be a nevela, might be unkosher, unfit to eat. What if the one that you slaughtered, you have a bird, slaughter one pipe, and that pipe is later on discovered to be dislodged? It's kosher. Shevadei achar shechita nekar, it for sure was dislodged after the slaughter. She'ilu nekar kaidem shechita hayam yizdaldel v'lei nishchat. Simply, technically speaking, had it already been dislodged before the shechita, you wouldn't be able to give an easy cut through the pipe. It would be kind of hanging down and not allow itself to ritual slaughter. When can we rely on this technical loophole? If the slaughterer wasn't holding on to the pipes as he slaughtered. Avalim tafsan b'shachar, but if you were holding on and then you did the slaughter, it's possible for such a pipe to be cut even if it's been dislodged because you're actually holding it in place. Therefore, if you discover one of the pipes to be dislodged and slaughtered, in this case it's a doubt, perhaps it might be a nevela, perhaps it might be unfit to eat. Whenever we said about a slaughter that it is psula, disqualified, harezu nevela, it means it's biblically disqualified, it's an actual nevela, it's actually dead kosher meat which is forbidden to be eaten. If you consume an olive-sized portion of it, you get lashes on account of eating nevela. The only thing which can get an animal out of its status of being a nevela is a proper shechita, a kosher shechita, kasher tziva, Moshe Rabbeinu, alav shalom, the way exactly that Moshe Rabbeinu gave us from Sinai, as we just explained. When there's a doubt in the shechita, it's a doubt whether the animal is a nevela, we can't hold you biblically accountable, and therefore, if somebody consumes this kind of meat, he will only be given rabbinic lashes. If an animal, its whole thigh was removed with the hollow, in other words, with the bone as it sticks into the joint, the whole thing was pulled out, such that even when it crouches, you can see the missing indent in the animal. This is considered a biblical nevela. It may as well have been cut in half and split in two parts. That's how bad it is. Any later ritual slaughter which you do to it won't help. Same if its neck bone was snapped and most of the meat surrounding that area was also broken in half. or it was torn from its back, like you tear open a fish. Or most of the windpipe was severed. Or even the smallest puncture was made to the food pipe in a place where it could be slaughtered. This is an animal that's a walking nevela. It's walking dead. The slaughter that you do later is not going to help. These laws are the same, both for animals or for birds. You should know, says the Rambam, that the food pipe actually has 2 layers of skin. And you can see this zoomed in the picture here. This is the food pipe resting on the windpipe, and the food pipe has the red outside layer and the white inner layer. The outer is red, the inner is white. When we say before that the food pipe has to be punctured to make the animal considered an avela, what do we mean? If only one of the layers became punctured, then it's still kosher. If both of them got a puncture, even in the smallest amount, in a place where it could be slaughtered, the animal is an avela non-kosher. Whether you would then go ahead and slaughter where the puncture was made, or you slaughter in a different place along the food pipe, the fact that it had the puncture at one point now invalidates any future ritual slaughtering, does not help. If both of the layers of the food pipe got a hole, but not corresponding to each other, one got a hole higher up, one got a hole lower down, nevela, it's still a biblical nevela, biblically not kosher, because the totality of it has a puncture on both layers. If the food pipe got punctured, but a scab covered it, blocked the hole, the scab is nothing, it is literally considered punctured as it was. If you discover a thorn sitting in the food pipe, now this animal is a doubt whether it's a nevela. Because maybe the fact that there's a thorn in the food pipe, the animal consumed the thorn, maybe that thorn made a puncture in the food pipe somewhere along the food pipe. It was already covered by a scab, you just can't see it. If the thorn is found lengthwise in the food pipe, we're not even going to worry. It probably didn't make a hole. It was simply descending as the normal way of animals' food is to descend. Most desert animals, non-domesticated animals, constantly eat thorns. Doesn't do anything to them. The food pipe. Because the outside is red, it's very hard to tell apart punctures. You cannot check it from the outside, only from the inside. What does that mean? How do you go about it practically? You must take the gullet, turn it inside out, and then check. If you find a drop of blood on the white layer on the inside, this is a way to know for certain that it was punctured and it had a hole. If the windpipe was severed in most of its diameter in a place that could be slaughtered, this is a biblical nevela. Now, the reason why the Rambam says Roiv Chalala appears to be because, as you can see here, this is a view of the entire neck, a cutaway. You slaughter from here, going inwards. Here is the windpipe. The windpipe, at its lower point, at least the way the Rambam's commentaries explain it, how to match it up with modern anatomy is another story. There's been much debate about this topic exactly, but at least at the bottom of it, according to the Rambam, it's thicker. So when you're coming in, this is a little bit of an upside-down picture, but you're coming in to the windpipe, you're coming in from this side where it's thicker, and you're making a cut. We said that to invalidate the windpipe, it has to be severed more than half. The Rambam now uses the word Roiv Chalala to indicate that more than half doesn't mean more than halfway across the total area of the windpipe. It means halfway across its diameter, which is a little bit later. See, if you count from here to here, then the halfway point is at the top blue line. But if you're counting just the inside of the diameter of the actual windpipe, then the blue line that marks halfway point is over here. So the Rambam says Roiv Chalala, most of its inner space has to get severed, and that makes it into an avela. Also, if along its length, here's the length of the windpipe, if it got a hole, which is the size of an isar, size of a small coin, that makes the entire thing invalidated. Nikva nekavim ketanim. If it got a series of small holes, im nekavim she'ein ban chisarin heim. If they're holes that don't have anything lacking, just a little puncture like with a needle, doesn't take away any of the skin. Mitzdarfim leruba, they can combine. And if all the holes together, had you made a slit that size, it would sever most of the windpipe. They combine and they make it forbidden. And if there are holes that have something lacking, they've taken away a little space of the skin of the windpipe, they can combine to the amount of a coin size to also invalidate the entire animal. Same thing if a strap, in a longer way, was taken off, the strap size was taken off of the windpipe, that strap, although it's a longer slit and it's not necessarily round, the area of it could combine to creating the area of the size of a coin. That's all if it's an animal. If it's a bird, much smaller pipes. You have to gather up the entire area of the strap or the holes that have a little bit lacking. Transfer them, figuratively, to the top, to the mouth of the windpipe. This is the bird's windpipe, the size of this hole. If all the holes along the length of the windpipe equal to the amount of a majority of the diameter of that hole, of the area of that hole, nevela, then it's a nevela. It's disqualified. V'im lav, if not, kshera, then it's still kosher. Nikva hagargeres nekev mefulash mishnei tzdadeha kadeshi yikonis isar lerachbai. The Rambam says if you have a slit along the windpipe, and it goes all the way through. In other words, it's a hole that begins on this side and ends on the other side, and there's enough space in that slit for a coin to go in widthwise, not the size of a coin. The thickness of a coin can fit through that slit. Nevela, the animal is a nevela. Mistakala arka, but if the windpipe was cracked along its length, this way, not this way, even if only the tiniest bit remains above and below the slit, kshera, it's kosher. Because the animal by nature will kind of pull the windpipe, stretch it this way, and the slit will thereby become closed, allowing for easy recovery. Halacha chaf hey gargeres shenikva. The windpipe got a hole. But you don't know. Did the hole come before the slaughter, after the slaughter? We make a puncture along the windpipe at a different point. Compare one hole to the other. If the holes look alike, it's permitted. Both holes were made after the slaughter. But if not, then of course then it's forbidden. However, we can only compare holes made in a big ring to another hole in a big ring, or a small ring to a small ring. As the Rambam describes in a moment, you'll see that the windpipe is made up of a bunch of rings. The connective tissue between the bigger rings is what the Rambam refers to as the small rings. So if the hole is on the big rings, then you have to make another hole in another big ring. If the hole is in the small rings in the connective tissue, then you have to make a hole in another place in the connective tissue. We can only compare from a big ring to a big ring or from a small ring to a small ring. But not from a small ring to a big ring, because the entire windpipe is a series of rings. And between each two big rings, there's a smaller, softer ring that connects the two. That's called the small ring. And so again, we can only make comparisons between rings of equal size.